Hi everyone! On this channel we dive into the most gripping survival stories that happened in the wildest conditions imaginable. There are countless stories where people, either by sheer accident or reckless courage, found themselves face to face with death. These stories shock us and make us think about the true cost of risk. But today's story feels like something straight out of the horror movie. What happened to Juliane Koepcke is almost impossible to believe, but it's 100% real. A 17-year-old girl fell from 2 kilometers up in the heart of the jungle full of poisonous insects, snakes, and crocodiles and survived. But she didn't just survive, she found her way to safety. But before we get into that, let's go back to the beginning. Juliane Koepcke was born in 1964 to two German zoologists, Hans Wilhelm and Maria Koepcke. Juliane was their only child, and ever since she was little, she spent a lot of time in the wild with her parents. Since they were zoologists, most of their time was spent deep in the jungle. Juliane was especially close to her mother, while her father was more focused on his career and came across as distant. Even though Hans was irritable and hot-tempered, and Maria was caring and gentle, they managed to build a strong family. Even a 10-year age gap didn't stand in their way. They were united by their love for nature. The whole family was deeply dedicated to their research, and little Juliane was part of their small expedition team. In the 1968, the family moved deep in the Amazon rainforest and built a small settlement called Panguana. It was basically a stilt house with a few small structures surrounded by dangerous wildlife. They lived without any modern comforts, no running water, no electricity, no regular communications. But her parents felt like the happiest people on earth. Now, imagine being a little girl or a little boy growing up in such extreme conditions. For Juliane, it was a real adventure. She later recalled, "I had a very strict routine. My dad taught me math, and every morning I would go into the forest with my parents." The survival skills she picked up during these years in the jungle would later become vital for her. Soon Juliane had to return to Lima because the education authorities insisted she needed a proper schooling. In March 1970, she and her mother went back to Lima so she could take her exams at the German-Peruvian school. On December 20, 1971, Juliane successfully passed all her exams and graduated from school. Her mother was eager to return to the jungle, to be with her husband and continue their research. And she insisted they book tickets for December 20. But Juliane had her graduate prom scheduled on 22nd and had been looking forward to it for a long time. She managed to convince her mother to stay a bit longer. After the prom though, just before Christmas, all the plane tickets were sold out. Maria eventually managed to buy 2 seats with an airline called Lanza. Juliane later recalled, "Lanza had a really bad reputation. When my dad found out we were planning to fly back with them, he said, 'Please don't fly with Lanza. Fly with any other airline, just not Lanza.' And he had a point. Lanza's planes were all Lockheed L-188 Electras, American-made aircrafts that many believed were unsafe to fly. From the start of their service, they had a poor track record. Eventually, after several crashes, all airlines stopped using them. Despite her father's warnings, Juliane and her mother boarded the plane on December 24 at 11 a.m. Juliane sat near the very back of the aircraft. There were still 2 rows of seats behind her. Her mother took the middle seat, next to her. Takeoff went smoothly, but about half an hour into the flight, things took a terrifying turn. Juliane describes what happened. "We were just 15 minutes from landing, and suddenly it got completely dark. We had flown right into a storm. The turbulence was awful. Packages, cots, and bags were flying out of the overhead compartments. Christmas cakes and presents were flying around the cabin. People started crying and panicking. Then I saw a blinding white light over the right wing of the plane. At that moment, my mother, as if sensing what was about to happen, calmly said, 'Now it's all over.' The plane went into a dive, and I heard this heartbreaking scream from the passengers, along with this strange deep roar from the engines. It didn't sound like the usual engine noise. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. The noise disappeared, I was outside the plane. It was completely quiet in my ears. I was out in the open air. I hadn't left the plane. The plane had left me. Apparently, Juliane was the only passenger in her row who was fastened her seatbelt. The entire section of the cabin was ripped out during the crash, and she, still strapped into her seat, fell 2 kilometers straight down into the heart of the Amazon rainforest. Amazingly, she survived the fall. Juliane doesn't remember exactly how she landed in a way that kept her alive, but she clearly remembers the fates of others who had also fallen still strapped into their seats. Later, she came across remains of other passengers in the jungle. She recalls the heads of passengers, 2 men and a woman, were smashed a meter deep in the ground. As for how she managed to survive the fall, Juliane later came up with a few theories. First, a strong upward air current from the ground may have helped slow her descent. Second, the row of seats that was torn loose during the crash could have spun as it fell, reducing the speed of the fall. And third, the trees she landed on were extremely dense and tingled with vines, which absorbed much of the impact. In any case, it was nothing short of a miracle. She had survived the crash, but her story was just beginning. Now she had to fight for her life. Juliane didn't regain consciousness right away. She likely had a concussion. She realized her collarbone was broken and her legs and shoulders were covered in deep cuts. She later said, "I lay there in a fetal position for the rest of the day and all through the night until the next morning." The next day, she found the strength and courage to try to get help. Her vision was blurry, and it was hard for her to get her bearings. Like anyone would in her situation, she hoped that maybe her mother had also somehow survived, and finding her became Juliane's first priority. By some incredible stroke of luck, she had fallen just 50 kilometers from Panguana, her home. She knew the jungle very well, having spent lots of time there with her parents. She later said, "I wasn't afraid because I grew up in this environment. It was my home. There was almost nothing my parents hadn't taught me about the jungle. I just had to dig that knowledge out of my concussion-fogged brain." But it was still the wild rainforest, full of poisonous spiders, venomous snakes, jaguars, and other deadly animals. And the nearest towns were very far away. When she looked around the crash site, she found nothing except a small bag of candies, which would become her only source of food. Just like her mother had told her, the first thing she did was find a stream and follow it. But in the jungle, small streams are everywhere. She needed to find a bigger river, because settlements are more likely to be near larger waterways. Then she heard the call of hawksins, a type of a bird. Her mother had told her that these birds usually live near big rivers or lakes. So Juliane immediately started moving in the direction of the bird sounds. She carefully made her way through thick, dangerous vegetation, hoping she was on the right track. Fortunately, she was. She eventually reached a large river. But now there was a new danger. Though river might lead her to people, the banks were impossible to walk alone due to dense undergrowth. That meant she'd have to walk in the water, which was teeming with piranhas and venomous stingrays. Don't forget, she was still bleeding heavily from her wounds. But Juliane wasn't just covered in wounds. She was also starving. She knew that in the damp rainforest, despite being hungry, it was better not to eat any berries or plants, since most of them were poisonous. At one point, she saw a frog sitting on a tree. She had no idea what kind it was. Driven by hunger, she considered catching and eating it, but the frog was quicker than her and got away. That moment of failure saved her life. It turned out that the frog was a poison dart frog. Its toxins wouldn't necessarily kill a human, but in her weakened condition, it might have been enough to finish her off. From time to time, Juliane heard rescue planes flying overhead, scanning the jungle for wreckage. But the forest canopy was so dense, there was no way she could signal them. She kept wandering through the jungle until, on the first day, she heard the cries of vultures. She instinctively knew what they were gathered for and forced herself to follow the sound. When she got there, she saw something straight out of the nightmare. She found 3 passengers still strapped to a row of seats, just like the one she had been in. But unlike her, they hadn't been lucky. They had hit the ground so hard that their bodies were driven almost a meter deep in the soil. Among them was a woman. Panicked, Juliane checked the woman's toes, desperately hoping it wasn't her mother. Later she recalled, "The woman's toenails were painted. I breathed a sigh of relief. My mother never wore nail polish." By the 10th day, Juliane was completely exhausted, covered in wounds, starving, and with no hope left. She kept walking. For 10 days, she had endured brutally hot days and bone-chilling nights in the jungle. Just when she was ready to give up, she saw a small hut by the riverbank in the distance. A little shack was empty. Among the fishing gear inside, she found a canister of gasoline. The wounds on her legs and shoulder were now infected with maggots. She had often seen her father treat dogs for parasites using gasoline, so she quickly decided to try the same method on herself. She later said, "The pain was just unbearable. It felt like the worms were digging deeper into the wound. I pulled out around 30 maggots and was very proud of myself. I decided to spend the night in the hut." The next morning she was woken up by the sounds of men's voices approaching. She rushed out, and when the Peruvian fishermen saw her, they were horrified by her appearance. A thin, injured girl covered in deep wounds emerging from the jungle. Some of the superstitious locals thought she was a water goddess and was about to run away in fear. But Juliane's parents hadn't only taught her how to survive in the jungle, they also taught her Spanish. So she shouted, "I'm the one of the passengers from the crashed plane. My name is Juliane." The fact that the fishermen showed up at the exact hut at the very next day after Juliane found it was yet another incredibly lucky twist of fate. The men hardly ever visited the shack. The fishermen saved her. Of the 91 people on board the flight, she turned out to be the only survivor. Reports say between 12 and 40 people initially survived the fall, but none of them made it out of the jungle. The investigation revealed two main causes of the crash. First, most of the plane had been assembled using spare parts. Second, no one had properly prepared for flying through such severe weather conditions. The hospital where Juliane recovered was surrounded by journalists, all desperate to find out how she managed to survive. Even after she fully recovered and returned to her studies in Lima, the media wouldn't leave her alone. Eventually, her father sent her to continue her education in Germany. The move was extremely stressful for her. Her father had fallen into a deep depression after losing his wife, and Juliane was now far away from the jungle that had been her home all her life. Juliane had a falling out with her father because he forbade her from going back to Panguana. He had been living completely alone in the jungle before he finally gave up and returned to Germany himself. Though the two eventually reconciled, he never really recovered. It seemed like the tragic loss of his wife had broken him beyond repair. He couldn't even look at his daughter because Juliane looked so much like her mother. But eventually, Juliane did return to Panguana. She lived in her childhood hut for another 18 months, studying different species of bats for her doctoral dissertation. If you enjoyed the video and want to hear more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.